At Quite the Thing Media, we aim to bring you the best podcasts produced by independent creators, made without constraints.
Hey everybody, it's Dan from the Pop Culture Hootenanny, woo-woo! And I just wanted to let everybody know to join the podcast father on this journey, sharing great things all sorts of creators are doing. He's the Indie Podcaster! Yeah, something like that. The Indie Podcaster, the podcast father. Check him out.
You've been searching for a podcast. Want to know about some great artist? You've come to the right place. Indie Podcaster with your host, the podcast father.
We have made it to another episode of Indie Podcaster. I don't know how we're hanging in there, Tim McCarthy, but we are. Welcome to the podcast. I'm Jeff, a.k.a. Podcast Father, and like I said, my good friend, the great Tim McCarthy joins me.
My man, always great to be with you. Always great to chat with you. And I was actually pretty pumped I got to see what you look like, because you're a very handsome father.
Thank you. Losing a little bit more hair than I would like, but you're repping the bald look pretty well. I should just give it up and consider that. Yeah,
you got to come to the doc side. It's very easy. You don't have to really get any haircuts. You don't have to have those conversations with the barber where he's like, "Hey, how about you just give it up?" You're like, "Okay, I'm sorry."
Boston's finest, everybody. Tim's got a podcast, 20 TI minutes. No, I'm just kidding. It's not that. There's a whole story behind that, But if you really promote, if that was able to get out there, you might get some discoverability from it. People were like, 20 TI minutes. I got to check this out. Anyway, no, check Tim's podcast out. 20 minutes. He's got a great spin on mental health that's relatable, and everybody should give it a listen.
Yeah, I'll always be here for you. Just 20 minutes. You can find me either way. 20 TI minutes would be a podcast about TI, and my intro song would probably be like, bring them out, which actually is pretty a good idea. But I'm 20 minutes. Come and say hello.
You can have whatever you like.
Yeah, dude. I might make a second podcast and make it that.
I'll get on board with you. Let's segue into the interview that we're going to share today. I had a conversation with Dave Keine. Yes, Keine rhymes with Heine. He is the head of product and marketing at Podchaser. I had a chance to sit down and chat with him about podcasting. Podchaser
is a great app. Oh, no, they need an app. Good website. They kind of have like the MySpace mold in the top 8.
That's true. It is a great website, and they really have a great database and the structure they're building for podcasting. And Dave and I actually talk about the direction of the company's wanting to go in the future. He even shares some advice for podcasting that he has, but it's a really good conversation. And anybody listening to this, and a lot of people who do listen are content creators or podcasters, they definitely know Podchaser, and they've been making big moves lately. Earlier this year, they invested quite a bit of money into a bunch of different things they're doing with their company, and they've expanded their employees, and they're really looking to make a move.
It's a very clean website. I'm not just saying this. I'm not sponsored by them by any means, but it's a clean website. I like the logo. Their Twitter interactions are pretty money. I always feel like when they're out of the norm of the company, it's good. Like they have some good little banter and questions with their followers, which I like a lot. But yeah, I'm excited to see what they do next.
Absolutely. And I do think everybody will enjoy this interview. So I'm going to share it with you. But before we get into that, let me take care of that little business. Ain't that right, Tim? From Boston.
You damn right.
Jeff here. I want to talk about a few things that keep this podcast going. If you like the work that I'm doing, I encourage you to share it with a friend. That really is the best way to spread the word about Indie Podcaster. I would love it if you would go to your favorite podcast listening platform, may it be a Apple or Good Pods, and leave me a rating. Throw me some stars if you would like. All that word of mouth and sharing reviews of this podcast does help. This podcast and myself are a proud member of Quite the Thing Media. Quite the Thing Media, podcasts that speak to you. Go check out all the great independent creators from around the world. It is a community-based podcast network. QuiteTheThingMedia.com. If you want to check out my page, it's QuiteTheThingMedia.com/podcastfather. You can request a review from me on site or submit a form to participate on this very podcast. Podpage is a proud sponsor of this podcast. Podpage is an amazing resource to build your podcast website. You want them big search engine hits. You want to be out there. You want to leave your mark in the digital world. And this website makes it extremely easy to do that. You can set up your podcast website in just a few minutes. Make sure you check it out, podpage.com. That's enough of all that. Let's jump into this awesome interview. I have Dave Keine, and he reminded me that it that it rhymes with Heine. Dave Keine from Podchaser. He's the marketing guy. What's going on, Dave?
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me. And yes, I've had all kinds of crazy iterations of my last name. So I appreciate you for pronouncing that correctly.
I'm excited to talk to you today. Obviously, I see a lot of Podchaser stuff and familiar with the site to an extent, but looking forward to talking to you to get to learn even more about it. So Dave, tell us about you and when you started with Podchaser and that backstory.
Yeah. So right now I'm the head of product and marketing over here at Podchaser, which is kind of like in charge of growing the product. So on the marketing side, I think that's kind of self-explanatory. We want to make people aware of Podchaser. We want to kind of get into the trenches with podcasters and listeners alike and kind of figure out what they're doing and try to be in those conversations a little bit. And then on the product side, kind of in charge of, again, kind of serving the listeners and the podcasters, but determining what we build on our website and with our database so that we can better serve the community. But yeah, I started here, I guess it's been 2 years now, back in summer of 2019. I came over, I had previously worked in advertising and kind of worked up as a creative director, working with some big brands out there to do promotional advertising, kind of got my foot in the door of podcasting and started with the sales side and then into content, ended up starting my own content studio and produced a couple podcasts, and then took the leap over here into startup land with Podchaser when the opportunity came along. And it's been great so far. We've been growing like crazy. It's a lot of fun. The team's great. Really fun to come into work every day and think about podcasting and how we can make tools and experiences that are going to help out podcasters. And so, it's been really rewarding.
A pretty decent portion of my audience are podcasters. What is the backstory on Podchaser? When was it founded and why exactly?
Yeah, Podchaser was founded, I think officially back in 2017. It was founded with a Reddit post. So one of our co-founders, Bradley Davis, the story goes that he was commuting a lot and listening to these really long form podcasts, things like Tim Ferriss, where it's like these 3-hour long episodes. And he would hit play and he didn't know if it was going to be a good episode, especially if it was somebody who he had never heard of was going to be the guest. And so really what Podchaser started with was a desire to have individual ratings on individual episodes rather than kind of the top-down Apple Podcast way of, just rating a whole series, but just the individual episode. So it started that way. He posted on Reddit asking if anybody wanted to help him build the IMDb of podcasting. And our CTO, so Chief Technology Officer, Ben Slinger, who's down in Australia, responded and said, "Hey, I'd like to build this." They got involved, started working together, brought on a designer in Ryan Stock and an operations guy in Cole Raven, and just kind of started tinkering away at it. And over the years, it's built up from that kind of MVP version of you have the ability to rate and review individual episodes to we've added things like credits. So who's on a podcast, whether it's the host, the guest, or even like the producer or behind the scenes folks, you can add those to Podchaser, and we have about 12 million of those. You can also do things like create shareable lists. And then around a year and a half ago, we introduced what's called the feed, which is really like the social element of our website, database, discovery platform, whatever you want to call it, that allows you to follow your friends, follow creators, follow podcasts, and actually you'll get updates when they do stuff in podcasting. So if you are out there and you go and review a podcast, I'm going to get a notification of that, hey, he reviewed this podcast. said it's 5 stars. This is what he said. And then I'm going to discover it from there. Similarly, if I follow a creator and say they're a guest on a new episode, I'm going to get a notification of that. Podcasting is such an opaque medium where we don't necessarily know what's going on because so much of it is hidden behind audio, and audio isn't necessarily searchable or anything. So what we're really just trying to do is to take these bits of, I guess you can call them data, but just like insights into what this podcast is about or what people think about it, and just trying to give that to the listener and to the user so that they can make a good decision about it. And so that's where like the whole solving podcast discovery thing comes into play, is we're really just trying to get more podcasts in front of people that are a bit more relevant to them.
From an employment standpoint, how many people does Podchaser employ?
If you asked me back in January, it'd be about 8 to 10 full-time employees. And today, I think we're pushing close to 40 now. So we raised our Series A fundraising round and hiring like crazy, mainly in the development space. But yeah, it's growing very rapidly.
I did see that earlier this year, you Podchaser, I'm just going to say infrastructure, invested quite a bit in the infrastructure piece to be able to grow as a platform. I mean, that all times out right with bringing on more people as well.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Podchaser, to me, it seems like you guys are really on this big attempt to be more personable, because there are several different social podcasting apps, platforms, whatever you want to call it. You guys are based on the web right now. Do you have plans to invest in and maybe develop an app?
So we get this a lot, and I think it's probably out there somewhere, for the same reason that like McDonald's has an app. Like it doesn't necessarily suit us perfectly, but people like apps, and it's a good way to get out there, and you want to meet people where they are. I think right now our decision to not have an app is actually somewhat of a strategic one. And I'll give you a little insight on that. So on the first part of that is, one of our core tenets is to be what we call agnostic in the space, which is we are fundamentally taking a collaborative approach when it comes to using our data, our API, our infrastructure and database, and allowing other companies in podcasting to use that. And so like one of our foundational values is to be collaborative with other podcast companies. So we're not looking to actually like take over and like become your daily driver podcasting app. We're not looking to like dethrone a Pocket Cast or anything. Really what we're trying to do is to power those apps, to make them smarter, because you may like Pocket Cast, you may like Podcast Guru or Player FM or any of the countless podcast apps out there. And really that's a matter of personal taste. What we would like to do is make those apps even better, so that if you do like something, maybe you have the ability to search by credits and creators and see, and have discovery mechanisms in there. So by creating an app, instantly what that does is just puts down a bit of a firewall around us, where people who we would otherwise collaborate with, maybe they don't look at us as, a good partner at that point, or maybe somebody who's just buying their time to enter the market. And we're definitely not doing that. So that's one piece of it. And the other piece of it is, because we're a website and not an app, we can really meet people where they are. You don't have to have a specific device. You don't have to be only on mobile or only on desktop. You can be on any of it. You don't even have to be logged in to see everything on Podchaser. And then it's all Googleable. Mm-hmm. And so if we're a discovery platform and we want to work with everybody, and we just want to help people find new podcasts and interact with podcasts, it's 2021. The two main ways that people find podcasts are their friends tell them about it, or they go and Google it. That's basically it. So by allowing everything on our site to be Googleable, we end up ranking like in the top 3 for so many different Google terms. And really that helps us solve what is ultimately our mission, which is to help people find more podcasts more often that they're going to like.
Yeah, Dave, I asked that question just to get it out of the way. I had a feeling I had a feeling on the answer, but that is a question that I know you're asked all the time, and the people listening are going to wonder that.
There's a couple reasons I think why people want an app. I'd be interested to know what you think a little bit, but it seems there's kind of two buckets where it comes in. One is convenience factor of just being able to have like an icon on your phone or in your app drawer that just as you're going throughout your day, it's, one swipe up and maybe a tap and you're in, right? Versus having to go to a URL and type in podchaser.com or even like go through your bookmarks or anything. That seems to be one. And then the other side seems to be, I wish you had, you meaning Podchaser. I wish Podchaser had more features like my Daily Driver podcasting app, such as, sleep timer or a better player, or even just, maybe like a grid system to where I can see all of my podcasts in one space without having to scroll a little bit more. When you think of an app, what is it that you're really looking for on your end, do you think?
I think you just hit the hammer on the nail, because I think all that, you said convenience at first. I think all that is convenience, right? When you're talking the podcast player piece, all that to me is a convenience thing. But for Podchaser, and I'll try not to go off on a soapbox here, I can tell it's more about being a podcast resource. An example that I have seen recently, you started working with Mark Asquith and then Captivate Audio people. You're doing different things like that. So you're leaning more towards a podcast resource.
A little bit, yeah. I think that's actually one of the fundamental things that we're not looking to change, but looking to build upon is you can use Podchaser to do a ton of stuff. If you want to go and filter and find the most popular podcast hosted by Captivate hosting provider that was released in 2019 and has a rating over 5, like you can do that. One of the things that we're looking to do is to make it a little bit more to where that information, if it's relevant to you, I don't know that that's relevant to anybody, comes to the top a little bit more, right? So you have the ability to log on to Podchaser and see what is most relevant, and we can almost anticipate your needs. That's where we're looking to go forward with that. We're looking to serve listeners, and by serving listeners, serving podcasters on that end. But yeah, there's definitely a resource arm of what we do. We're a database, and we're easily the most comprehensive podcast database. There's a ton of different data sources that go on top of it, and kind of how we look at things is we combine both like intrinsic data. So like, what is this RSS feed doing? What is the reach of this podcast? All of that stuff that's kind of like that binary quantification of a podcast. But then we're able to marry that with what we call crowdsourced data or human data, which is everything on our database can be interacted with by the user in terms of, like I mentioned, we have credits. You can go on there and you can add credits. You can say Shaquille O'Neal was on this podcast as a guest, and you can mark that down and you can add to the database, kind of like a Wikipedia. All of that goes through moderation for accuracy, but things like that, tags, we have categories that aren't on other platforms, lists, all of that stuff allows us to kind of, like I said, when audio is an opaque medium and there's so much lost, to try to bring out the intangibles of a podcast. Is this podcast actually similar to this other podcast? And we can tell that not only because of like keywords and everything, but because the people who listen to this podcast also listen to this podcast, or they've been grouped in this list of the best true crime podcasts. And that just kind of helps us to kind of, again, go towards our mission of just helping solve discovery for podcasts and listeners.
I do think it's twofold, right? Because talking with people that operate and manage a social podcast sharing app, a lot of the feedback that they get is, why don't you have a website? And I will say it is very important when you're a content creator or a business owner. There's a couple different things. One is that you have to really determine what you're going to focus on. And that is where you put most of your energy for sure. And that's what you guys are kind of doing. The other thing for actually like being a content creator or podcaster, it's absolutely critical to have a digital trail out there. We talk about CEO and then you're talking about Google. It's important to have those kind of things. And that's why I always encourage podcasters to have an actual site, a website, even if it's something like a Podpage who I work with. That stuff is critical. And you guys are a part of that as well.
Absolutely. Being on the marketing side over here, I do a lot with like search engine optimization and just kind of even the theories around that and how do you rank well in Google, but also how do you make sure that there's a lot of entry points into your website. And I think a lot of that can apply to podcasters. Taking that stance of how can I create the largest net to bring in my audience. And a website is so big for that because not only is it a place that, if people Google your podcast, they're going to come up and they're going to be able to, see what you make. But a podcast page also allows you to then say, hey, if you want to go listen on this specific app, here's a link to it. And so you kind of meet people where they are. But then also building off kind of like that SEO theory, backlinks mean a lot. And by backlinks, I mean linking to other websites and having those websites linked to you. And so when you have a website, you have something that you can own and create backlinks to. And so when you link to the different players out there, you're increasing their likelihood of ranking better on Google when you link to your Podchaser page, or maybe your podcast got mentioned in an article by somebody else. If you can use your website to link to that, again, that's just another signal to Google that, hey, we need to lift this stuff up, get it up the ranks. And every time you move up the ranks, more people are going to discover you. And then it becomes almost like a sustainable passive traffic engine for you to be able to just kind of keep bringing in new people to your podcast and growing your show at that point.
It is critical. And I think if you're just doing it for fun, that's one thing. But I think once you get your feet on the ground and you feel comfortable and you've got the handle on the content part of it a little bit, then that is the next step. You really need to start thinking about the things that you just talked about, because as far as being discoverable and growth, it's absolutely critical. Absolutely.
And like you said, content should be first.
Yeah. So going back to the audio being able to discover audio, that is a big challenge. Why do you think that is?
I think there's a couple reasons. The first is just, it's a waveform, right? Like audio is something that nobody has really solved the transcript problem of transcribing what people are actually saying in a podcast. So there's just kind of like an MP3 file there. And what's inside the MP3 file, it's a bit of a black box until you actually hit play. Until we get like mass transcription, that's probably always going to be the case a little bit. Also, I think for the most part, podcasting's somewhat of a solo activity, even though when people do find a podcast that they really like, they can't, be quiet about it. And then obviously, if you have a podcast, most people who have a podcast are going to promote that. I would say most of podcast listening is a solo activity, and you finish a podcast and you kind of move on, because there historically haven't been a lot of tools to then go interact with or even talk about the podcast in places. So I think that's also why you see really successful podcasts have thriving communities, to where once they get done listening to the podcast, they can go and talk about it, make memes about it, interact with the host, all of that. But yeah, I think it's that transcription problem of just, it's a little bit of a black box medium. And then up until recently, there haven't been a whole lot of opportunities to interact with podcasts and to easily evangelize or let other people know what you're listening to. And so there's that kind of slow social aspect to it all.
I'm proud to announce that the podcast father, myself, Jeff, and Podpage are teaming up for this sponsorship. Podpage is great, guys. Like I was telling you earlier, it is so critical to have an actual podcast website. I know the link trees are used a lot, but you need an actual website. You need something that's going to show up in Google. You need something that's going to show some hits, a trail that will lead to your podcast. And there's not a better way to do it than Podpage. You can build a beautiful podcast website in 5 minutes. Automatically create a listener-friendly podcast site from your RSS feed. Customize the design to create a professional look you'll be proud of in just a few clicks. There is no coding or technical knowledge necessary. There's a free trial to give this a shot, and there's different packages ranging from free to all the goods and gadgets, but still at affordable prices. Podpage is big supporters of indie podcasts, so make sure you support them also. Go on podpage.com and get your podcast website set up. With that being said, we will roll into this segment sponsored by Podpage, where we will play a trailer from a different indie podcast every episode. I hope you enjoy it and give them a listen after you're done listening to my show. Then afterwards, we'll jump back into the interview.
Never forced, never coerced. Open discussions about things in life that matter to you most. From tech to TV, movies, and gaming, and everything in between. Streaming live every Tuesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern on Twitch, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. And be sure to join us every Friday night at 11 p.m. Eastern and Saturday night at 11 p.m. GMT for Weekend Chill, exclusively on Mixcloud. Welcome to Voluntary Input.
You talked about it, and I have too. Podcasting is a very personable thing. It's most of the time, if you're going to listen to something new, it is a word of mouth thing. And I still consider like social media word of mouth as well, right? If I'm messaging you, Dave, and I say, hey, and we're comfortable with each other, and I say, hey, you need to check this podcast out, you're much more likely to do that than just seeing a random post. So it's still personable being on social media or just face to face. So how does Podchaser continue to try to be more personable for people? And you already are doing it in more ways than people realize, by linking up to all the different things that you are as far as other platforms and things. But as far as a website, getting people onto your website, what are some things that you guys have talked about maybe improving in and just being able to relate to people more and get them on your site and stay there?
Yeah. I think one of the things that you just mentioned, where the power of a human recommendation is so strong, that's one of the core initiatives that we're pushing forward right now, which is we want to breed tastemakers. If you look at any other medium out there, whether it's TV and film or video games, there are people out there who spend their time reviewing or commenting on a form of medium, and people follow them and take their opinions. Roger Ebert in TV and film is a great way to look at it. Of, this guy would give thumbs up, thumbs down. He has a whole website that's going on now, even though he passed away a few years ago, that has not only his old reviews, but also new people are coming up and they're becoming tastemakers, right? So we're really trying to empower the listener to build their own following and to bring people along, and hopefully they're going to have fans who, I've never met Roger Ebert or anybody. But if I see that he rated something well, I may value his opinion a bit more and use that to decide what I'm going to listen to. We don't always have to know the person who recommends a podcast. And so that's part of it, is just building up that community of tastemakers. The other part is giving podcasters more opportunities to interact. A few months ago, we released the ability to reply to reviews, which is something that a lot of podcasters wanted, whether to say thanks and let their audience know that they were actually reading the reviews, or, maybe they got an unfavorable review and, they're not going to do a clap back, but they may take the moment to kind of set the record straight and just say like, okay, I thank you for this. Maybe you want to check out these other episodes. I got a lot better later on, or something. Really focusing on making those things a little bit more interactive. And there's a bunch of plans for things like community forums, custom badges that you can assign to your listeners, and a bunch of other things that we have out there. But I think if we really look at it as like the two main things, it's that breeding of tastemakers, critics, people you can follow who have opinions that you value, and then creating just more opportunities to interact between listener and podcaster, listener and listener, and even podcaster and podcaster.
You said you put a lot of focus into the creator piece. And I do know that I've seen creators tagging themselves in the episodes of my podcast and various other things.
Mhm.
That is a pretty neat aspect where you can almost credit yourself.
Yeah. Crediting people is
I mean, people and yourself, you know what I mean? But like people literally can go in and say, tag it to mine saying they were a guest. I didn't even have to do it, you know?
Oh yeah. And because it goes through a moderation process, we're able to ensure that it's accurate, right? Like that's the big thing is I know there's some efforts out there to have like a person tag on the RSS feed. It doesn't matter if it's not accurate, right? So we try to create the best opportunity for more credits to come in, which is where we have that crowdsourcing ability, where anybody can come on and they can add credits. But then the almost more important part is making sure that it's accurate. So it all goes through our kind of pipelines and ends up in front of a human who can make that decision, who can listen to the audio and say yes or no of whether or not this is a real accurate credit.
Yeah, there is a lot of moderation with that. There has to be a lot of time and effort, but that's part of your guys' thing. You want a respectable platform. You want it to be right, authentic.
Yeah, it doesn't matter how many credits we have if they're not accurate. And one of the things that's really cool about being a data company is our ideally we want Podchaser to be something that just runs super smoothly and we can all go sit on a beach and it's working well in the background. So we have a focus on things like artificial intelligence to help out our human moderators and give them kind of signals of, is this accurate? Is this something that needs more scrutiny? Can we look at this specific part of a podcast and make it easier to really quickly and easily determine if the credit is accurate or not? Working on that right now. We're overhauling all of that stuff. I think you're going to see Podchaser credits in a ton of different places here in the next probably 12 to 16 months. Yeah, we have to make sure our infrastructure is really locked down before kind of the whole of podcasting descends on us, I think.
A lot of people that have an app, I'm going to say people, but a lot of businesses from a business standpoint, their first focus once they've got the base of like an app or a website is getting people on there that actually use it and can consume it. Mm-hmm. However, it seems with Podchaser, there's a strategic approach to build outside relationships. You're not telling people to come on there, you still are, but you really built all these bridges. Then you're going to bring it, then everybody's going to be able to get to it easier and then bringing everybody in sort of kind of approach, in my opinion. You guys are out there, you're involved on social media, but it seems like you spent a lot of time and effort on preparation for being able to bring everybody in. And then once they are there, be satisfied.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Obviously, we want millions of people to use Podchaser, but there is one of the great things about being a venture-backed business is that we can have really long-term views, right? One of those kind of long-term views is, again, marrying that kind of intrinsic and that human data. We're able to build some really, really cool stuff. We just have to have our eye on the horizon a little bit. So bringing in data, partnering with people, bringing in more people who are going to add the crowdsourcing elements to our site, all of that stuff just kind of feeds itself. And there's definitely, when we look at it, a kind of iron sharpens iron kind of situation to where more data that comes in. To be clear, like data can be like a scary word. All of this is like the data about a podcast. It's not like user data or anything like that. We're not Facebook.
No social security numbers or anything.
No. But yeah, like as all of that comes in and as our systems, our pipelines are created, it all just sharpens itself. And so, yeah, I think a lot of people ask us like what our business model is because we're a website. It's free. Anybody can come on. Right now we have API, which is basically access to our database. It's free, but if you want like millions of lines of data or something, we do charge for that. So we have some API partners out there. We also have what's called Podchaser Pro, which is like a business to business product that allows places like advertising agencies, PR agencies, to come on and see, what is the reach of this podcast out here? Or do they rank on Apple Podcasts or Spotify? What are their demographics? All of that. But I think long term, what we look at is where we make money isn't that we're going to like one day just, throw up a $9.99 sticker on podchaser.com and put up a bunch of banner ads or anything. I think it's more so we're going to take all of this data and use it to do things like maybe we'll create a jobs marketplace. We already have credits that people use as like their resume for what they've done in podcasting. Maybe we put something up there to where they can add a resume and people can come on and hire a new producer for their podcast or a freelance sound designer, right? Or it could be, in the future as we bring on all this data is maybe there's a focus group aspect to all of this, to where if you are a podcaster, you can tap into the tastemakers on our platform to preview early episodes or to give feedback on something that's in production, so you can get a little bit of feedback there. So all of that's a kind of fancy way of saying we're focused on the data and marrying that intrinsic and that human side, because there's so many cool things that we can do if we look at like the long-term horizon of Podchaser.
I do interact with a lot of different podcasters. Some are really, really, really new, and then other a little bit more experienced, obviously. So I made sure when this interview got scheduled, it was over a month ago, so I've had time to kind of approach it. But I asked a lot of the newer people what I should ask you, and a lot of them was about the app. Mm-hmm. I asked some of the people that have been in podcasting a little bit longer to ask you. They weren't necessarily as worried about the app, but as far as using the site, we're curious if there is going to be more of an effort or ability to personalize their creator space a little bit more.
Yeah. Personalization is a huge thing, right? Like that's the whole purpose of having profiles. There's one thing to be said for just making sure our data is easy to browse and all that stuff. And we're still working on that all the time. Yeah. I think I'm not going to overpromise anything, but we were recently working on some design mockups that do offer a lot more personalization for the listener. And then for podcasters, there's a ton that we're looking at in terms of just like, how do you, one, personalize your page, but also two, how do you personalize actually how you interact with the site and with listeners, and doing things like when somebody leaves you a new 5-star review, maybe there's an opportunity to just make sure that instantly goes to your social media, or the ability to embed that on your website so that people can see it. There's a ton of stuff that we want to do, but I'd be interested to know kind of just like where they see personalization, because it can mean a lot of different things. And I want to make sure that we're doing the right stuff.
That's a big part of it. But I think there's like the big challenge for you guys is, how do you keep it professional? And I don't want to say universal, because you don't want it to be universal across content.
I don't want it to be MySpace with like the GIFs everywhere of stars and all that.
How do you keep it very leaning professional, but also give the person the ability to visually impact their page when you go to it, whether you're a listener or creator? There's a fine line there.
There is. I think, to put on my design hat a little bit and get into the weeds a little here, I honestly think there's a little bit of a parallel here with interior design in a weird way. Of, if you go and look at a lot of like the common trends or just like what looks good out there, a really common angle is that you have the big pieces of a room or of a living space are fairly neutral, right? They're there. Maybe it's like a white couch or, a soft gray color, and it's kind of neutral. And where the personality comes through is in some of the smaller elements. And so that's things like a pillow here, or a really cool painting, or maybe this accent piece. And I think that's kind of our approach to personalization a little bit is you have to have the neutrals because people have to come to your page and they have to know how to interact with it. They need to know exactly where to look to find the latest episodes or to find how to follow you or to share your page. But on those smaller elements, that's where we can pack a whole lot of personality in a way that doesn't disrupt the user experience. So being able to have, custom badges that you share to the listeners who are the most rabid following of your podcast that really spark on the page and create a lot of personality there, or the backgrounds to your cover art situation, if we can bleed off and use some of those elements, all of that stuff is going to help accent the kind of core use of the page and bring the personality through versus like I said, like a MySpace style where like we change the whole background color and there's flashing lights and a song plays or anything like that, which is definitely personality, but it would cause it to be harder for people to interact with your podcast, especially brand new listeners.
It's a beautiful answer, Dave. I like what you're relating it to there. So before we end this interview, man, what about you, Dave? So what were some of your podcasting influences? What kind of podcasts did you listen to? Or do you listen to, or did you first?
I think when I started listening to podcasts, if I had to guess, I think like the first podcast I ever listened to in earnest, like I had listened to a couple before, but I was like, okay, I'm going to listen to a podcast. I'm pretty sure it was a Freakonomics episode in like 2013 or 2012, maybe. And I was actually spending the night in the Dulles airport because I didn't get on the last flight and I had to get on the next one and I was broke. So it was just like I put in some headphones and was listening to it. But yeah, I kind of started there. I really liked the kind of documentary style podcasts back then, Radio Lab, This American Life, and kind of the normie tastes there. And since then, kind of grown to listen to pretty much everything. I really like just conversational podcasts. Now I found that there's different uses for podcasts. So like if I'm driving down the road on like a really long road trip, maybe I will go into like that documentary, that like true crime or that journalism style, or even a fiction podcast that I can like, just spend hours with. But like in my day to day, especially like, get up and do the dishes or something, I'll throw on, a No Dumb Questions, which is a podcast out there with a couple of YouTubers, and there's just conversation and it kind of goes well. I would say my most recent podcast that I really like, I guess it's not that recent anymore, but there's a podcast called Richard's Famous Food Podcast. The creator describes it as like Pee-wee's Playhouse for food journalism. It's just, he plays with the form. It's super crazy and it's just really well done. And so, yeah, like if you're out there and you're looking for a podcast, try that one.
Last question for you, Dave.
Yeah.
What advice would you give content creators that are just getting started? Or an example would be a new podcaster. Being somebody in the profession, different. You talked about sales, design. You've touched different aspects of this profession. What advice would you give somebody starting out? There's
a kind of paradox in my answer. So the first part of my answer is I highly recommend making a podcast on paper before you ever start making a podcast. And by that, I mean, define what your podcast is about, come up with 20 different episode ideas, maybe add a little bit of flesh to those of, what is this episode going to be about? Maybe write a paragraph about it. Talk about like the tone of your show, what the music's going to be like. And what that's going to allow you to do is to just visualize everything, come up with a plan for each part of your podcast. And then when you do get 10 episodes in and maybe things are getting a little hectic at work or at home and you feel like, oh man, I don't have a lot of creative energy, because your motivation is the absolute highest when you decide to make a podcast. Like you probably will never have as much motivation to make a podcast as that beginning part. So it's important to have a plan so that when you do get out there a little bit further along, you have something to fall back on and can keep you going until you get your motivation through. And part of that is also planning like, hey, 10 episodes in, I'm going to take a 2-month break and come back. All of that stuff is just kind of going to allow you, when you don't necessarily have the willpower, to come back and kind of rely on something instead of being out there all by yourself. Now, the reason that's a paradox is because you can spend months and months doing that, and you can use it as like procrastination technique. So the other piece of my advice is just start recording, talk. It's amazing how hard it is to say one word onto a microphone, but then after you do it for 5 minutes, you can do it all day. So you don't have to publish everything you record, but start recording yourself. Even if it's just, I'm going to spend 10 minutes with my microphone and I'm going to read Wikipedia and talk to myself. And then once I get done, I'm going to hit the delete button, never see this again. I do think it's important to just get into that kind of familiarity with the microphone. And hopefully that also helps balance out to where, you don't procrastinate and never make that podcast you've been talking about for 2 years kind of thing.
Great advice, Dave. I do encourage everybody to get on podchaser.com and check it out, whether you're a listener or a content creator. I'm glad you did this interview with me today. I tried to do this conversationally in a way that maybe that you hadn't, questions being asked that you hadn't heard before. So I do appreciate you taking the time to do this today.
Yeah, thank you very much. And these were great questions, and I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Really do appreciate you listening to this episode and checking it out. I hope you continue to do so with the next. I hope you have an appreciation for what I'm trying to do here, highlight all the different things all sorts of different creators are doing. I hope you get behind me on that and continue to join me on my journey. I'm Podcast Father, the Indie Podcaster. See you next time.